The spirits of Salem. How alcohol fueled the witch trials. When someone gets burned at the stake, you'd assume they were sober when making the accusation. Turns out, history was just one long, messy night out, with terrible morning-after decisions. The witch trials of early modern Europe and colonial America stand as some of history's most bewildering moral panics. Between the 15th and 18th centuries, an estimated 40,000 to 60,000 people were executed for the crime of witchcraft. But what's rarely discussed is how alcohol, that beloved social lubricant, played a central role in this dark chapter of human history. Grab your goblet and settle in. This isn't just a story about superstition gone wild. It's about how the contents of people's cups may have helped light the pyres that consumed thousands of innocent lives. Before we dive into the frothy depths of this topic, let's set the scene. Early modern Europe wasn't exactly a theme park of enlightenment. Life expectancy hovered around 35 years. Disease was rampant. Infant mortality was heartbreakingly common. And clean drinking water? About as rare as a witch with an actual broomstick. Which brings us to our first intoxicating fact. Everyone, and I mean everyone, was drinking alcohol. Men, women, children, even babies. Water was often contaminated, but fermentation killed harmful bacteria. The average person in 16th century Europe consumed about 3 liters of beer daily. Not because they were party animals, but because it was literally safer than water. But here's where it gets interesting. The alcohol they consumed wasn't the carefully regulated 5% ABV beer you sip at happy hour. No, this was a wild west of brewing and distilling, with alcohol contents that varied wildly and contaminants that would make today's health inspectors faint faster than a Puritan at a pride parade. In the German town of Würzburg, site of one of history's most infamous witch hunts, wine was particularly important. The region's economy depended heavily on vineyards, and bad harvests could spell economic disaster. When crops failed, as they often did during the Little Ice Age of the 1600s, people didn't blame climate patterns. They blamed witches. The Würzburg witch trials from 1626 to 1631 claimed between 900 and 1,200 lives. And guess what happened right before this murderous spree? A series of devastating frosts destroyed the region's precious grape harvests. About as coincidental as finding yourself at Taco Bell at 2 a.m. after a night of tequila shots. But bad wine harvests weren't just economically devastating. They were existentially terrifying. Wine wasn't just a beverage, it was holy. The Catholic Church required wine for the sacrament of communion. No wine meant no proper mass. When the wine went bad, so did people's judgment. Speaking of bad judgment, let's talk about ergot, a fungus that grows on rye and other grains used in both bread and alcohol production. Ergot contains compounds similar to LSD. Yes, that LSD. When consumed, it causes hallucinations, convulsions, psychosis, and a burning sensation in the extremities, sometimes called St. Anthony's fire. Historians now believe ergot poisoning may have played a role in several witch panics, including the most famous American case, Salem, Massachusetts in 1692. The symptoms of ergotism: spasms, hallucinations, and the sensation of being pricked or pinched match many of the bewitchment symptoms described by accusers. And what were they drinking in Salem? Hard cider and beer made from local grains, the perfect vectors for ergot contamination. When teenage girls started writhing on the ground and claiming invisible forces were tormenting them, no one said, "Maybe it's that funky batch of homebrew." Instead, they started building gallows. It's worth noting that Salem's witch trials began in winter, when food stores were running low and people were increasingly relying on whatever grain they had left, often the dregs most susceptible to ergot contamination. By the time spring arrived with fresh food, the panic mysteriously began to subside. But ergot wasn't the only mind-altering substance at play during the witch trial era. The very people tasked with identifying and prosecuting witches were often swimming in alcohol themselves. Take Matthew Hopkins, England's self-proclaimed witch-finder general, who was responsible for the deaths of around 300 women in the 1640s. Historical records show Hopkins and his assistants would often celebrate, Successful witch identifications with copious amounts of strong ale and spirits. Nothing says reliable legal procedure like a prosecutor who's 3 sheets to the wind. Hopkins pioneered the swimming test for witches, binding a suspect's hands and feet and throwing them into water. If they floated, they were guilty. If they sank and drowned, they were innocent. Congratulations, you've been posthumously acquitted. One can only imagine how many of these tests were conducted after a hearty round of drinks at the local tavern. The connection between alcohol and witch hunting went beyond mere consumption. The production of alcohol itself was often viewed with suspicion, particularly when women were involved. For centuries, brewing was primarily women's work. The alewife, a woman who brewed and sold beer from her home, was a common figure in medieval and early modern communities. These women worked with bubbling cauldrons, mysterious ingredients, and processes that transformed ordinary substances into mood-altering potions. Sound familiar? As commercial brewing became more profitable in the 16th century, male-dominated guilds pushed women out of the industry. Suddenly, the same brewing practices that had been accepted for generations became suspicious when performed by women outside the new economic order. The iconography of witches, the cauldron, the broomstick used to mark houses selling homebrew, and the pointy hat worn by alewives to stand out in marketplace, all derived from the female brewer's trade. In a cruel twist, many women accused of witchcraft were former alewives who'd been economically displaced by male brewers when bad batches of beer caused illness or strange behavior. These women made convenient scapegoats. After all, they knew the magic of fermentation and had a motive for revenge against the community that had rejected their services. The tavern itself played a crucial role in witch trials. In an age before mass media, the local alehouse was the information hub, where rumors spread and reputations were made or destroyed. After several rounds of drinks, whispers about odd neighbors could transform into full-blown witch accusations. Court records from the period show many witch accusations originated during drinking sessions. In 1692, in Stamford, England, 3 women were accused of witchcraft after a drunken argument at a local pub. By the time everyone sobered up, the accusations had taken on a life of their own. 2 of the women were hanged. Even the interrogation of suspected witches frequently involved alcohol. Accused witches were often denied sleep and plied with alcohol to lower their resistance to questioning. Under these conditions, many confessed to impossible acts, flying through the air, transforming into animals, or having sex with the devil. It turns out that sleep deprivation and alcohol are about as reliable as a magic 8-ball when it comes to extracting truthful testimony. The witch hunters themselves often developed elaborate drinking rituals. In parts of Germany, witch finders would drink a special concoction called witch beer before beginning their investigations. This brew, containing herbs like henbane and mandrake, was believed to protect them from the witch's powers. Ironically, these very herbs are powerful hallucinogens that likely made them more susceptible to seeing evidence of witchcraft everywhere. One particularly disturbing drinking custom emerged during the height of the trials. In some German towns, spectators would gather to watch witch burnings while enjoying specially brewed witch beer. Vendors sold this brew along with snacks, creating a festival atmosphere around public executions. It was essentially Renaissance Coachella, but with more actual burning and less cultural appropriation. The connection between alcohol and witch trials extended to the very top of society. King James VI of Scotland, later James I of England, was obsessed with witchcraft and personally supervised the torture of suspected witches. He was also a notorious heavy drinker whose court was known for its drunken debauchery. His influential book, Daemonology, essentially witch hunting for dummies, was likely written during periods of heavy drinking and paranoia. By the late 17th century, as the scientific revolution gained momentum, attitudes toward both witchcraft and alcohol began to change. The same emerging rationalism that questioned the existence of witches also led to improvements in brewing and distilling. As alcohol production became more standardized and less prone to contamination, the wild hallucinations and convulsions associated with bewitchment became less common. The decline of witch trials coincided with the rise of coffee and tea drinking in Europe. These new, non-alcoholic beverages created spaces for sober discussion and rational thought. The first coffee houses appeared in London in the 1650s, just as witch trials were beginning to wane. Correlation doesn't prove causation, but it's hard not to notice that as people switched from all-day drinking to occasional coffee, they became less inclined to burn their neighbors. The last execution for witchcraft in England took place in 1716. Around the same time that gin production was becoming regulated after the notorious gin craze, had led to widespread social problems. The last legal execution for witchcraft in Europe occurred in Poland in 1782. By then, the Enlightenment was in full swing, and the drinking culture had shifted from constant alcohol consumption to more moderate patterns. Today, we look back on the witch trial era with horror and bewilderment. How could our ancestors have been so cruel and irrational? The answer may be as simple as it is disturbing. They were often drunk, drinking contaminated alcohol, suffering from mass hallucinations, or using alcohol to fuel their worst impulses. The next time you enjoy a craft beer or fine wine, raise a glass to modern food safety standards and the separation of church and state. Your drink is probably not going to make you hallucinate demons or accuse your neighbor of flying on a broomstick. And if it does, perhaps consider switching brands. The witch trials remind us that what we consume affects how we think and act. In an era of social media bubbles and algorithmic rabbit holes, perhaps we should be asking ourselves, what's in our metaphorical cups today? What modern intoxicants are clouding our collective judgment? If you've enjoyed this sobering look at the relationship between alcohol and witch hunts, be sure to subscribe to our channel for more explorations of how drinking has shaped history. Visit our website, bevclass.com, for cocktail recipes and spirit knowledge considerably less likely to result in hallucinations and moral panics. Until next time, drink responsibly. The lives of your neighbors may depend on it.